The folded scrap on the table looked like it belonged to another life. Frost had rhymed the widow's teacup beside it. The matchbox lay empty, its striker dulled by 100 small fires. Elias Thompson stood in the doorway and let the cold press the edges of him, the way a hand might test a wound. The shack smelled of last night's embers, and the slow, stubborn grief that had lived here since Ruth left her chair empty. He set his hat on the peg, and looked again at the paper. In his wife's looping hand, hurried as if written with thought and interruption, were a few lines from a page of her old notebook. She had kept it in a tin box by the hearth, the same tin that still held flour-dusted recipes, and the ribbon she would tuck into Mary Beth's hair. Elias's thumb found the familiar loop of an R, and then, beneath the words that made his throat go tight, a single command that a child's imagination could turn into a map. Go back. He did not know who the instruction had been for. He did not know if Ruth had meant it to be a plea to someone else, a private thing written the year before the sickness took her, or the month she learned to make her bread without burning the crust. He only knew that Mary Beth had taken it, folded small as a promise, and gone. The chair near the stove still bore the faint impression where Mary Beth had sat the night before, knees tucked to her chest, a rag doll on her lap. Elias saw her in that hollow, saw the way she hummed in a high, uncertain tune when she braided his hair with nimble small hands, the way she would press her ear to his chest, as if to listen for the steady of him. He had gone to water the mare and left for the barn. When he returned, the cottage had been emptied of its small music. Footprints trailed out from the plank doorstep to the hard powdered path beyond the lean-to. They were little, a child's stride that had been picked clean by purpose. Beside them, a different print, deeper, wider, cut the snow in a line Elias did not like to see. Adult boots, not his, dropped at angles that spoke of haste rather than joy. In the dim, the mare's breath steamed in small gouts. Ash stamped and pawed as if she too could smell the absence. Elias picked up the scrap of paper with hands that had never known to tremble before sorrow. The letter, or whatever it was, had a smudge of flour on one corner. Ruth's hand, probably, on the table when she wrote. The looped sentence did not say where to go. It only said, in Ruth's careful strokes, go back. A child could have understood it as a summons, a dare, or a wish. He thought of the places Ruth had loved. The willow bend by the Gunnison, an outcrop of rock where she once said the world felt small enough to hold. He thought of the way she carried the smell of warm bread in her hair, and the way Mary Beth, within the first year of her life, had learned to find comfort in that scent, as if it were a tether to something unseen. Elias folded the paper the way Mary Beth might fold it, and slipped it into his coat. Then he saddled Ash. The first tracks were the easiest to follow. Mary Beth's prints were a line of small crescents punctuated by the occasional scatter where she had run, spun, or dropped something. Elias followed these with an old man's patience and a father's urgency. The winter kept the world honest. Trails held what they were until sun or new weather washed them away. He found a glimmer of red in the pines, thread caught on a branch, the scarf he had knit for Mary Beth last autumn. It was damp with melt, and the fibers clung to ice. He braced Ash and took it between his fingers, tasting bread and tea in the air, the tiny domestic perfumes that memory turns into treasure. A glove lay further along, one of the child's small mittened hands that had been pushed off in the scramble. It was warm, as if Mary Beth had only just left it. There were other tracks too, boot prints that did not match the looseness of a town merchant's gait, prints that dug in and pressed the snow down as if the person who wore them carried weight of tools, of ammunition, of a night's intent. Elias's mouth went dry. He knew the marks of traveling men, men who meant to take what they could if the taking carried no risk. He knew the rumors that came down from the ridge. Hank Colton kept a ragged company and liked the easy pickings of winter-strained homesteads. He had kept out of Elias's yard and, for a while, out of the thoughts that had been too heavy already. The tracks brought that weight back like a winter wind. He rode hard. The day was a thin gray sheet. The Gunnison River lay like a strip of smoke. The banks fretted with ice. The town of Cotton Ridge had a single main street of false front shops and a general store that smelled of tallow, coffee, and the kind of gossip that pressed itself into every crack. He spurred Ash at the sight of the post he knew by heart, the place where men left small notes for one another, and feeling in his chest like someone moving toward a hurt that had yet to be named. On the square, he found Mrs. Hopper at the steps of the feed store, wiping her hands on a rag. Her hair was pulled in a bun so tight it made a neat frill at her temples, but there was softness around the eyes that had watched children learn to walk. She looked at Elias as she had the first winter he had come through the town with Ruth, with a womanly appraisal, the kind that weighs steadiness higher than show. "She's gone," Elias said without preamble. The words had the bluntness of the cold. Mrs. Hopper's ladylike composure did not crack. "Gone where, Elias?" "Mary Beth." He let the name sit between them. "Left the house. Took something." Mrs. Halper's glance flicked to Elias's coat, to the way the scrap of paper bulged against his chest. Her fingers tightened on her rag. I thought she was with the teacher." "What teacher?" "Clara Mayfield. Brought her in before noon. Said she had seen a little one roaming by the willow. I sent Eli out to check, but he said someone had passed the place earlier." She looked at him as if gathering courage out from behind the town's skin. "Took her to the Mayfield place, near the river." "Elias." He had been called by his full name more times than he liked, in tones ranging from pity to accusation. This time it carried neither. It was a fact laid like a stone. He found the schoolhouse easily enough. It was shuttered for winter, the single window darkened by a wool blanket pinned from the inside. Beyond it, the lane dropped to the river, where a small clapboard cottage sat half buried behind a stand of cottonwoods. Smoke rose from its chimney in a thin, steady line, the sort that smelled of peat and the slow burn of a woman's mind. A dog barked somewhere inside. Copper, the Mayfield's old shepherd, known for his habit of seeming taller than he was. Clara met him at the gate. She was younger than Elias had remembered, her hair bound back in a practical bun, the hem of her skirt still dusted with flour. There was mud at the knees where she had knelt to sweep, an apron with a flower ghost at the front. She bore the pragmatic look of someone who kept small things in good order because they were the only things that would listen. When she saw Elias, some of her composure gave way to the quiet of people who know sorrow by name. "You're Elias Thompson," she said, as much confirmation as greeting. "I thought it was you. Come in." Inside, the cottage was warm like an oven, lids the midwinter chill, thickened air filled with the smell of bread. Mary Beth sat at the table in a way that made Elias think of an animal finally finding shade. She had flour streaking her fingers and the rag doll perched at her feet. Her cheeks were red from cold and excitement. She did not look ashamed. She looked as if she had found something too important not to bring home. "She smelled like oven," Mary Beth said before Elias had closed the door, as if that explained everything. "Clara made rolls. They smelled like Mama's, Papa." Elias's hands found the back of a chair. The word Mama was a blunt hammer, and he let it fall where it would. For a moment, memory rose in him sharp and warm. Ruth at the breadboard, the way she would sing under her breath and press the dough like a quiet blessing. Mary Beth's small voice made the hollow in Elias's chest ache, and then something protective sealed there. The scrap in his pocket was now a stone that could sink or anchor him. Clara handed him a cup of hot broth without asking. Her fingers brushed his palm and held the space in which an apology might sit. "She came by here this morning," Clara said in a quiet voice. "She told me she found a paper, said Mama wrote a place. I asked her what place, and she said it was a place Mama loved. I couldn't send her back out, not in that wind." Elias set the cup to his lips and let the heat go down like a promise. He watched Clara study Mary Beth, as if searching for a hint of what had given the girl courage. To Elias, Clara's questions were shields. "What paper?" he asked. Mary Beth held up a small rectangle with fingers that showed the cuticle marks of a child who had lived by the two rituals girls of the place learned early, braiding hair and reading the curls of someone's handwriting like a map. "It had Mama's writing," she said. "It said, 'Go back.'" I thought she meant the willow. Ruth loved the willow. Elias closed his eyes. The scrap in his pocket felt like a hot coal. His wife had written that phrase in her tidy hand. Its subject had been hidden in memory. Perhaps Ruth had wanted to return to something in a life before illness, or to someone she had thought to forget. Perhaps she had left it as a joke for Elias in some small domestic way that made sense only within the room she had rearranged. It did not matter now how Ruth had meant it. only that Mary Beth, at 7, had taken it as direction. Clara sat down across from Elias and unfolded the child's report with a careful patience that was half mother's pity and half teacher's strategy. "She wanted to go to the place on the map Ruth drew," Clara said. "She showed me where, this bend in the river where the stones make a little shelf. She said, Mama used to sit on the shelf and count the birds." Elias could see Ruth there, in memory, counting the world as if it were something she could keep in a jar. He wanted to laugh at the cruelty and tenderness of a wife who had left instructions that a child could turn into adventure. He wanted to curse the wind for allowing the child to cross any path. "Why would Mary Beth go alone?" Clara asked, not to him but to the room that held them. "Children don't mean to be gone." "She thought Mama called her," Elias said simply. He could see, like a map in his head, the thin line of footprints leading from his porch to the willow and then toward the trail. He had been to the willow with Ruth once after a frost. She had leaned against the bark and laughed at the way the ice hung from the limbs like lace. She took the paper. Outside, the light thinned. A small boy ran past the gate with a bundle of firewood, glancing at Elias as if to measure whether a man with grief could be counted on. Cotton Ridge's look at him was never tender. It was more like a ledger. People in the town had kept a careful account of the Thompsons' misfortunes and had tucked their pity into the margins. Clara's hands were steady as she spoke. "I could have brought her here before I left for school, but the snow made the road treacherous. I didn't want to send her out again. She wants things to be as they were." Her eyes slid to Elias with an ache that honored him. "She said the house smells like the bread your wife used to make. She kept saying Mama over and over and would not listen." Elias heard in Clara's voice the map of a woman who knew how to read the currents under a child's impulse. She meant to protect. She also had the kind of calm that didn't trust the townsfolk to do right by a child without argument. "Do you think?" Elias began. His words stopped under the weight of what possibility meant. To speak Hank Colton's name aloud was to invite hard considerations. "No," Clara said before the fear could shape itself into his thought. "But I can't see why any man would be out by the willow today, not with the snow. There were tracks, but they were from earlier. I left a couple of loaves rising on the counter in case she got cold. She said the bread smelled like Ruth's." Mary Beth reached into her pocket and, with the serious manner children have when they perform adult things, produced a small handkerchief edged with embroidery. Elias had seen that stitch before. Ruth's careful cross-stitch in the corner of that same handkerchief. The little bluebird they had preserved like a secret. The fabric trembled a little in Mary Beth's small fingers. "I kept it," the girl said. "I thought if I had Mama's handkerchief she would know me." Elias's jaw unclenched. The handkerchief was the same one Ruth had used to dab away flour at the breadboard, to wipe away tears when Elias was away for long trails, to press to a fevered child's brow. Mary Beth holding it like a talisman made Elias understand what had happened in the crawl of that morning. The child had reached for continuity in a winter that had taken the shape of absence. He had planned in his head to take Mary Beth home and lock the door, to bundle her with the fur in the kettle and keep her story as a small safe thing to bury in the hearth. But standing in Clara's warm kitchen, with the sunlight falling like a benediction on the table and the smell of bread rising, Elias felt the world tilt. Clara moved about with quiet efficiency, a woman who knew how to coax heat from a stone and to mend the torn seam without fuss. There was a steadiness there that reminded him, dangerously, of what life might be with help that was not strictly his. He asked her, after a pause that felt longer than any ride he'd taken, "Did you see anything else on the road? Men? Tracks?" Clara's brows drew in. She hesitated as if she had a child's respect for a man's pride and did not wish to bruise it. "There were prints farther off," she said. "I saw them where the field dips toward the old fence. They were not our kind. They bent north, toward the ridge. I don't think it was anyone looking for a child, just moving." Elias's throat tightened. The name in the town's recesses rose again like a sour bread smell. Hank Colton. He had heard of them from the men who traded with the ranchers. The kind of rumor that took 2 breaths to say and a week to vanish. Colton's men could be in the neighborhood without making a noise that would be talked of openly. They left the sort of tracks people mention only to one another, eyes lowered. "I'll take her home," Elias said, because the words were a thing to do. He felt foolish offering protection as if it could be wrapped around a child like a blanket. It would, though. He knew how to sit up nights and watch the wind. He knew how to read the signs of a man's trouble. He rose from the chair with a weight in his chest that was part fury and part fear. Mary Beth's small hand sought his sleeve and held on. "Take me, Papa," she said simply. Her trust was a cord that he could not break. As they left, Clara handed Elias a small bread roll, still warm and soft. "For the road," she said. Her fingers lingered against his palm, an unspoken offering. "If you go after them, stop by tonight. There's a lamp in the window, and copper will warn if anything comes too close. You don't have to—" He cut her off gently, not because there was shame, but because he felt something open inside, a recognition that the town would watch, and that watching could be sharper than any weapon. "Thank you, Clara," he said, "for keeping her." On the porch, the wind had turned a needle. Ash stamped and tossed her head. Mary Beth climbed into the saddle with the ease of a child who had been placed into arms enough, and who therefore trusted them. As Elias settled, he felt the scrap in his coat like a stone of blame. He followed the trail back through the trees, eyes scanning for the boot prints that had cut the snow with intent. The red thread of Mary Beth's scarf glowed against the white like a staked flag. The river bent ahead, and the willow, Ruth's willow, stood on the bank, its long hair of branches freckled with frost. Elias remembered Ruth there, fingers in the bark, eyes closed against the sun. He had thought then that the world could be kept in simple rituals. Bread, a chair brought by the fire, a child to name the light. He had been wrong in ways that did not let him be bitter, only attentive. When they reached the place where Mary Beth had said Ruth used to sit, they found another set of tracks, heavy-booted prints that led away from the river and toward the ridge. They were old, at least a day, but the snow had not yet swallowed them. Elias rode to the edge and dismounted, the cold rolling up through the leather of his boots. He pressed his fingers to the print and felt the compression of someone who had been in a hurry. "Did you see someone?" he asked Mary Beth. "No." She craned her neck and looked toward the tracks that led away. "But I thought I heard singing. Mama sang like that sometimes, soft and happy." Elias tasted the word told by the girl and found it almost barbaric to think that anything like singing could be an answer. A man singing could be a sign of camp. A child singing could be a compass. He could not keep the two out of the same space. He put Mary Beth on Ash and set her ahead of him. He wanted her to see the willow again, to have proof that she had not imagined the place. He wanted to give her the small, irrefutable reassurances that could be traded for the possibility of danger. They rode back into Cotton Ridge as the sun lurched low. In town, people looked up and watched Elias go by with the ready curiosity of those for whom other people's lives are a safe entertainment. He kept his face blank and his mouth silent. People had opinions about how a man should grieve, about how a father should keep his child. Elias had learned to hold his judgments like a mule holds a pack, carefully and with patience. Night came down quick and bone true. When they reached home, the cottage door creaked as if surprised to see them. The hearth had cooled into a memory line. Elias set Mary Beth by the stove and set 2 loaves of Clara's bread between them like a small defiant son. They ate in a quiet that was half relief. Mary Beth's hands fumbled with the handkerchief as she pretended to practice napkin manners. Elias watched her and found that the sight of her so alive, so filled with the small human music that had been missing, made the long months of his mourning thin into a single raw edge that was both tender and dangerous. He folded the scrap of paper carefully and laid it on the table, the phrase, "Go back," facing him like a riddle. That night he sat by the window and looked at the horizon in which Cotton Ridge dissolved into the dark. He could not sleep. He thought of the boot prints that had angled away, of the way the townsfolk had looked at him as if to say he should take care, but also as if to say that grief made a man clumsy, and that clumsy men invite trouble. He thought of Clara at the stove with hands that knew bread and care, of Mary Beth with the handkerchief pressed to her cheek. He felt, with a clarity that matched the cold, that protection was a kind of weather, something he could not control but that he could predict and prepare for. Around midnight, when Ash stabled her head and the wind found the eaves and began to sing its low, complaining song, Elias heard something that made him stand and listen, as if a hand had clamped his spine. Footsteps, heavy and paced, crossed the yard beyond the fence. They were not the light, erratic tread of bootlicks or a tired neighbor's step. They were deliberate, spaced, a measure that made his heart count them. 3, pause, 3, pause. Nearer now, the sound of someone testing a gate, the scrape of metal against wood. Elias moved to the door and saw a shadow detach itself from the black, a tall shape that paused beneath the porch light and then lowered to half squat, as if studying the house's bones. There was the faint glimmer of metal where a man's hand rested near his hip. Elias's mouth shut and his breath condensed like a promise he must keep. He did not go outside. He had learned not to rush into the dark on anger alone. Instead, he took the bread from the cupboard and the last of the tin's tea. He filled a small bag, wrapped Mary Beth's handkerchief around it, and walked with soft boots toward the lean-to where Ash waited. He did not make a sound. In the yard, footprints that were new sank into the snow, clean and deep. They did not lead away from the house. They circled, precise and intent, as if whoever made them wanted to measure the space in which something inside might be kept. Elias's chest tightened with a cold he did not remember having ever felt. The measurement of a man's intent could be seen in the space he took up. He found Copper at the gate, where the dog stood with ears up, eyes bright and yellow in the moonlight. The dog's hackles were high, but he did not bark. He licked Elias's hand, and then looked out toward the dark line of trees. Elias felt Clara's presence suddenly bigger than the two-room house, a quiet ally against whatever might come. The shadow shifted again. The man moved away from the house and toward the low rise beyond the blacksmith's, a shape that might have been alone, but might also have been a scout for more. Elias watched as the figure turned and then vanished into the deeper dark. He waited until the yard settled into a hush, as if someone had taken a hand off the world's throat. When he returned inside, Mary Beth had burrowed under the quilts and clutched her rag doll to her chest, her small body curled like a question mark. Elias sat beside her and let the warmth of her smallness leak into him. He folded his hands around the roll Clara had given him and thought about the scrap in his coat. Go back. The words were a tide, and he was a man standing on the shore with a child in his arms. Which way did the tide demand he go? He finally lay awake until the first eye of dawn, listening to the house breathe and the river push against its banks like an old moving thing. The idea of riding after Mary Beth again in daylight presented itself as an obvious necessity, and yet he knew that what was obvious was seldom safe. Hank Colton's men, if they were indeed moving near, would consider a lone man with his daughter an easy target if the chance to take supplies or a horse made the price worth it. At first light, the world was a sheet of steel and shadow. Elias strapped the scrap to his breast and fingered the fold as if it were the map to some private treasure. He could not help wondering whether Ruth had meant the words for him at all, or whether she had simply been marking a circle on a life she would not return to. He had to find Mary Beth and bring her home, and yet there was a part of him that wanted to step back and read the letter again, to see if Ruth had left him another thread. Before he left, Clara put out a pan with 2 eggs softened over coals and wrapped the crust of bread in a cloth. "If you meet trouble," she said quietly, "come back to this house. We will not hide you. We will not ask questions that make a child small." Her invitation hung between them like a rope. Elias took it with a nod. He had never been a man to ask favors easily. He had been a man who did the work and expected the weather to be honest. But the current of the town had shifted under his feet, and there was a new element in its fabric. Clara's steady helpfulness, the way she looked at Mary Beth with a softness not put on for show, but because she had learned the value of small mercies. He mounted Ash with Mary Beth tucked before him, red scarf looped twice around her neck, the handkerchief safe in his pocket. The scrap of paper fluttered against his ribs with each step. He rode with the afternoon light on his back, and the knowledge that whatever tracks he followed might lead to a place that had nothing to do with Ruth, or to a group of men who would not give up what they thought they could take. They reached the willow and the river bend where Mary Beth had wanted to sit. The place was empty. The stone shelf the child's eyes had sought lay bare and covered in a thin sheen of ice. Elias slid from his saddle and sat on the damp rock, feeling it suck the heat from his bones. He unfolded the scrap again and read the few lines as if Ruth's hand could speak to him now across the miles of winter and the small years without her. A half-finished thought about going back to a place that had once been home. He heard a sound behind him then, the slap of a boot against a surface. Turning, he saw, not 20 yards off, the shadow of a man who had been crouching behind a thicket. The man rose with the slow grace of a thing that does not wish to be seen, but knows it mustn't be. Elias's hand went to the butt of his rifle before his reason caught him. There was no time for the muscle memory of violence. The man was alone, thin and pale as the winter day, and he looked as if he'd been seeing too much cold for too long. "You find anything?" the man asked, voice low and cautious, eyes cautious like those of someone whose life had been built on small, careful thefts. Elias did not answer right away because there was more than curiosity in the man's tone. He watched the way the man's fingers kept near his waist as if to touch the metal there, as if presence alone might cool the rest. There was the faint mark of a boot on the man's heel that matched the prints Elias had seen earlier, but not the breadth of Hank Colton's men, something less organized, more a scout than a band. "Just the girl," Elias said finally. "She's with me?" "That's good," the man said, and there was a strange relief in it, as if the truth had been a weight between them, and the man's admission relieved him of a suspicion. "You'd do well to be moving. That ridge is stirring. People been seen moving through last night." Elias's mouth made its line. "Hank Colton?" The man laughed, a sound that had the rust in it of a man who had eaten too many bad nights. "Hank Colton's boys are more talk than teeth this season, but talk still finds teeth when it wants to. If you're leaving, best to be west before noon." Elias watched the man melt away into the trees like a shadow that had no business being bright. He felt the scrape of old instincts wake inside him, to count his losses, to measure the risk, to save what was his. Mary Beth shifted at his back and hummed a small old tune that Ruth had used to hum. Elias thought of Clara's quiet kitchen and Copper's watchful eyes, of the way the town had held its breath when they'd arrived. He had to decide, in that moment, whether to follow a direction that the scrap had urged, a go-back that could mean returning to some memory Ruth wanted honored, or to keep riding away from the place that had cost him so much. He folded the paper and tucked it close. For a long moment he sat on the cold stone and let the river talk in whispers. The world was a line of choices. Go back, go forward, or take the only clean thing he could control, the child at his back. When he swung back into the saddle, Ash's breath steamed like a small cloud. The path ahead rose toward Cotton Ridge and beyond it, the ridge where men might be moving. He adjusted his hat against the wind and tightened the reins until the leather bit his palm. Mary Beth's fingers found his shirt at the small of his back, and he felt the human truth of himself. A father with a child, a small globe on his back against which all the world's weather might be measured. They rode toward town and the shelter of Clara's house at the river, where a lamp would be kept in the window and a dog would warn. The scrap burned in his pocket like a question he could not answer yet. The letter had begged him to go back, whatever that might mean. Elias could have returned to the heap of a life he had known, to the outline of Ruth's kitchen, to the quiet of the house where sorrow kept its seat. Instead, he kept riding, not toward the past, but for the small person who trusted him to be the future. He kept riding for Mary Beth because she was the only living map he had left. As they approached the town, a hand raised from a porch. It was Clara, wrapped in her shawl, her hair a dark knot behind her. She gave him a small, tight smile, and Mary Beth answered it by waving a flour-smudged hand. Behind Clara, the lamplight offered a pool of gold that did more than break the winter's gray. It promised company, but the promise was not simple. In the alley beyond the butcher's, a group of men moved like spare shapes, their talk low and their faces lined with maps of need. Elias slowed his horse. He felt the chill up on his neck like a coming. He could have kept going, taken the road that would break over the rise and into a life that required only his own brand of hard work. He could have chosen the isolated salvation of keeping distance. But there was a child at his back who believed bread could keep someone alive and a teacher at the river with hands that made warmth into an art. For the first time since the fever took Ruth, Elias felt the possibility of a different kind of keeping. Not holding everything, but choosing carefully what to hold close. He nudged Ash toward Clara's gate and dismounted. The men in the alley glanced up and then away, as if they had been studying a line they were not meant to read. A shadow detached from the group and paced near the livery. Hank Colton's kind of aim, perhaps. Or only a trail-rough man with a tongue for rumor. Elias walked up the steps to the Mayfields' porch with Mary Beth at his hand. Clara opened the door with that easy, unshowy courage she carried as if it were an apron she could put on and off. Copper circled his calves and then settled, eyes bright and watchful. "You're safe here for now," Clara said. Her voice was a candle that neither flared nor guttered. "Rest, I'll watch." Elias handed her the scrap reluctantly, as if he were putting an exposed secret into another's custody. She looked at the handwriting and then at him with the recognition of a teacher who sees every child's mistakes as part of the lesson. "Go back," she read softly. "Your wife wrote this." Elias nodded. He stood long enough to watch the way Clara folded the note and set it between her palm and the table's worn wood. The light caught the lines of the paper, as if the color of meaning might be coaxed out by the fire. Mary Beth curled at his side, the rag doll folded like a paper map. Outside, the men in the alley moved on. The town exhaled. Elias's hands, which had learned to mend hedges and coax scarves, trembled in the way of a man caught between two duties. He could stay and build a life with help and steady hands. Or he could return to the places a scrap of paper urged him toward, and seek a past that might not exist. He left the final choice for another daylight. For now, he would sit by the Mayfield stove and let the bread steam in the dark. He would listen to Copper's deep breathing, and to Clara's soft humming as she put the kettle on. He would stay awake with Mary Beth and watch the window like someone who knows that threats move like silent beasts, and that night is the family of decisions. When at last Elias lay down on a pallet in the corner, with Mary Beth sleeping against his chest, and the scrap of paper pressed into his coat over his heart, he thought about Ruth's handwriting, and the way a woman could give instructions that outlived her. He thought about leaving and about staying. The letter had begged him to go back. He had kept writing for his daughter. Outside, the river moved on, unknowing and unstoppable. Inside a small house, the breath of 3 people marked a light that might yet become a home. Dawn did not so much arrive as thin the dark to gray, the world outside Clara's window becoming one long soft promise. Elias woke to the damp, homey smell of last night's embers and the faint ring of the river in his ears. Mary Beth lay curled against his ribs, small and steady, chest lifting with the simple economy of sleep. The scrap of paper, folded and creased, pressed against his heart beneath the shirt like a stubborn thing that would not be put away. He rose without waking her and moved to the window. Outside, the town caught at light, chimneys exhaling, a dog barking somewhere that made Copper answer with a single low rumble, and the alley beyond the butcher's showed the shapes of men already on their feet. It was not a town given to violence most days. It preferred gossip to guns. But winter made need sharper, and where need exists, rumor finds the shape of a threat. Clara was at the stove, the motion of her hands practiced and efficient. She set a pan of eggs to warm and placed 2 loaves wrapped in cloth on the counter. When she turned, she wore the look of someone who had decided, in a simple womanly way, to see what could be fixed rather than catalogue what was broken. "You look like a man who hasn't slept," she said. Her tone was steady, not soft enough to be pity, and not sharp enough to be reproach. "I slept when there was a bed and a fever," Elias answered. He reached for one of the wrapped loaves and felt the heat come through the cloth like a small consolation. "How did you sleep?" "Like someone with a chair to watch," she said. Copper only stirred when the wind tried the latch. He thought of the circling footprints that had tried the latch of his own house the night before, and of the slow measurement of a man's intent. He thought of the scout in the thicket who'd told him the ridge was stirring. The strip of safety Clara offered felt fragile and honest. It occurred to him that most of the world, at its simplest, was a choice between staying and leaving, and that each choice carried its own sort of bravery. "If we go," Clara said, when they had eaten and the room smelled of bread and tea, "we should do it before noon. The sun makes the ice honest until it doesn't. And Mrs. Halper's boy, he's got a sled. She said she could spare a crate of flour and a few jars. He'll meet you at the big elm by the post." Elias wanted to insist that Mary Beth remain here, that he could keep the child safe within the walls of his own grief, but the image of boots circling his fence at midnight was too plain. He had no illusions about how clever a man could be when he needed something. He also had a fierce old knowledge of what it meant to move. To ride meant to choose where danger might find them, and to try to put it off. "Will you come?" Clara asked, with the small boldness of someone who understood that help sometimes needs asking. Elias looked at her for a long moment. There was a softness he had not expected, a steadiness of hand that had coaxed warmth from seed into bread. There was also the glance she gave Mary Beth, not of ownership but of concern that recognized how small things keep a life intact. He had learned, in the month since Ruth died, the difference between wanting and needing. He needed to keep his daughter safe. He wanted, quietly and with no language for it yet, to protect the woman who had kept a lamp in the window. "I don't want you dragged into whatever trouble this is," he said finally. "You'd take me along to make a point?" Clara asked, and there was an edge of humor that warmed the room like bread. "No." He gave the smallest of shakes to his head. "If I leave, you'll need a neighbor. Cotton Ridge likes to make lonely people into stories." Clara simply nodded, as if the idea of being part of a story was neither insult nor compliment, merely acknowledgement. She wrapped another loaf and handed it to him, and then stepped out to see Mary Beth into the cold. The child came to the door wrapped in the red scarf, eyes bright and dizzy with an excitement that frightened Elias with how close it lay to recklessness. Outside, the town stirred fully. Mrs. Halper's boy had indeed a sled, and the old woman herself, wrapped in layers, cheeks red with the cold, pressed a small sack into Elias's hand. "For the road," she said, and there was more than bread in the way she said it. "If you go right off, I want you to know folks didn't all take the easy silence." He thanked her and found a dozen other hands doing the same in a manner that was careful and cautious. A man at the livery, someone Elias had bartered shoe leather with, slid him a length of useful rope and a knocked old knife. No one met him with shouts or fanfare. Compassion in Cotton Ridge had the quietiveness of old wood, sturdy and plain. As they prepared to leave, a shadow fell across the street. Hank Colton's name tended to ride the wind like tobacco smoke, unpleasant, persistent, present enough to leave the taste. A lanky man from the alley, who had been lingering with a hand in his coat, watched them for a moment and then tipped his hat. "You headin' far, Thompson?" he said with that half-guarded curiosity men learn when their lips must say something kind. Elias had the air of someone who did not wish to give the town a show. He nodded once. "Just far enough to make the trouble a stranger's problem," he said. The man's eyes cut away, and for a breath there was the sense of a world in which everyone carried a ledger of debts and favors. They climbed into their saddles, and Clara opened her own gate to stand on the porch and watch them go. The pieces of a life, flour, rope, a salted pork, fit into the saddlebags with a neatness that made Elias think, again, of the economy of small things. They rode out of Cotton Ridge under a sun that tried to look like kindness. The willow bent by the Gunnison watched them leave, its branches beaded with ice that chimed in the wind like a lot of small bells. Mary Beth sat before him, feet tucked, face turned toward the world, as if it were the beginning of a story she had been waiting to read. Elias kept the scrap of paper close and felt, in the palm of his chest, the hard map of choice. The road rose into a place where the creek narrowed and the ice lay over its skin like a false glass, thin and tempting. The path there was a narrow ribbon that had to be trusted, and distrust had been a teacher to Elias for many seasons. He slowed Ash, felt the horse's muscles under him, felt the way the animal listened to the small noises of a winter world. "Papa," Mary Beth said suddenly, her voice small as a bell, "do you think Mama wanted us to go back?" Elias thought of Ruth at the breadboard and of that neat and terrible phrase, "go back." He had read it in a hurried hand, as if a woman had written something she meant to keep secret or to leave as a charm. He wanted to tell Mary Beth that the meaning of one woman's word could not be the map for the rest of them, but the child's question deserved more than a half answer. "Maybe," he said, the word careful. "Maybe she meant that sometimes you go back to the things that make you brave, not to what you had before. Maybe she wanted you to know a place she loved." Mary Beth nodded, as if that would do for now, and nestled into the fur as if the notion of bravery could be as tangible as the pad of hair at the back of his neck. Elias kept his eyes on the ice and the path, and when it was narrow they crossed it in a silence that was close enough to holy. The creek sighed under them, and for a moment the ice groaned like an old man's bones. Ash moved slow and sure, and Elias felt the thinness of life and how closely luck and care walked together. Halfway across, a sound from the bank, a swish through the pines, a voice that was not quite a voice, made him stop like a man who knows the world will not be kind if given the chance. He listened. It was only the wind and a fox, perhaps, or a man with the wrong company of shadows. The crossing finished, they reached the other side with no more than a shiver that passed through them like a small warning. They took the back road, a route Elias knew by heart, which skirted the lower slope of the ridge. His eyes kept chasing the shoulder of the land, searching for smoke and the hard geometry of a camp. The ridge, in winter, was not hospitable, but it was honest. Tracks were not easily hidden in snow. At the crest they found a small camp, nothing more than a handful of men around a sputtering fire, the shape of a tarp, and an empty can or two. The prints in the snow spoke of hurried departures. The fire was still warm. Someone had been there not an hour ago. Elias tied ash to a sapling and moved closer with the careful, silent foot of someone who has had to read other men's living patterns for survival. He found a scrap of cloth, red, frayed, and a bootlace frayed at the end. The scent held faint tobacco and the acrid tang of a man's sweat. It was enough to tell him that Colton's boys might have passed, but it was not proof they were camped to stay. The ridge had been used as a highway more than a home that winter. The sight of those traces hardened something in him that was not anger. It was a resolute kind of fear, the sort that makes one keep watch. He saddled up again and rode on, taking care to stay higher on the ridge where the wind would announce any approach. Hours passed in the measured movement of saddle and breath. Mary Beth hummed softly, a tuneless thing learned from Ruth, and Elias found that he too was humming, an accidental chorus of the two of them. Late that afternoon, they came upon a narrow gully where the ice had not formed thick and where an old drift had caught and hung like a sheeted animal. The crossing there was treacherous, the banks crumbled underfoot, and a wrong step could mean a tumble into water that licked with terrible cold. Elias dismounted and led Ash over on foot, feeling the sense of the world narrowing to the size of a man's courage. One step, another. He thought of Clara's lamp and Mrs. Halper's hands and of the scrap that said, "Go back." He did not know even then which was the braver thing, following a paper's plea into memory or tracing a child's small footsteps into a possible danger. He only knew which thing he had to choose. On the far bank, as they shook the water from boots and fur, a sound reached them across the hollow, the lonely, rough whistle of a man signaling. There were voices then, low, threaded with a rough mirth that spoke of men who thought themselves bolder than their lot. Someone laughed, the sound blown thin with cold. Elias crouched and looked across the dip. In the brush, a man moved, and behind the man were shadows that might be men or trees. The urge to ride hard and take them by force rose like a fever. He put his hand to his belt and found nothing of that fever's satisfaction there. Violence could invite more violence. Taking an enemy by force could take the wrong road for a girl who loved the smell of bread more than the sight of a rifle. He called softly, in the old low voice that has kept men from making stupid mistakes, "We don't want trouble." A man's head lifted. It had the lean look of someone who had been hungry and growing rough at the edges. "You shouldn't be out here," the voice said, and there was no mocking in it, only a fact stated as if it were weather. Elias didn't answer, because his answer would have been a fight or a lie, and both seemed poor economies for a life he wanted to hold together. He looked instead at Mary Beth, at the hand clutching the fold of his coat. "Turn back," the man called then, and Elias understood with the dullness of a man who has been reading signs that this scout or sentry had orders to keep people from moving the wrong way. "Maybe," Elias said aloud, "we're the wrong sort of people to keep from moving." There was a pause, as if the man behind the trees considered the remark. Then boots moved, and the shadow broke into a half-run that soon became a brisk approach. Given a choice between words and movement, the countryside had a way of choosing the latter. The man who came into view carried no rifle but a hard look, and when he stepped into the light, Elias saw the pale of a face that had been weathered by cold. "You've got a child," the man said. He was younger than Elias had expected, face hollowed by too many roads. "Best to head west. If you head east, you make trouble for everyone." Elias measured the moment. The man's warning was not a threat. It was an information exchange between people who needed to keep a distance for both their sakes. Elias thanked him and turned them westward, along the long line of the ridge that led away from the sun, and toward wild country, where a man could make a life if he had patience and enough stubbornness to outlast storms. They rode until their legs ached, and the day thinned into a kind of watercolor dusk. That night, they stopped in a hollow where the trees made a shelter, and the river could be heard like a distant engine. Clara's lamp had been waiting in the window when they'd gone. but by then she had already packed the small things she could carry: a bundle of blankets, a tin with sewing tools, a basket with a half-made scarf. When Elias saw her stride out into the wood to meet them, his chest gave a small private lift that felt exactly like hope. "You could have said no," he told her as he helped Mary Beth off the horse. "I thought you'd be kinder company," she said. "Also, Cotton Ridge has too many ears and you have a child to feed." They set a small fire, the smell of smoke and bread rising together in a way that had suddenly become the world's most important alchemy, turning small things, flour, warmth, hands, into shelter. Copper slept with his head on Elias's boot, a warm live stone that told of loyalty in its quiet way. That night they spoke in small bursts, not the fulsome confessions of a suddenly paired couple, but the practical conversation of people making plans. Clara tucked Mary Beth into a bedroll and smoothed the girl's hair. Elias watched her do it like a man who had been missing an ordinary mercy and had only lately discovered its shape. "You'll come to the ranch?" he asked finally, because drivenness had a way of being softened by asking. Clara's hand hovered over the child's brow. "I can make bread," she said simply, "and I can teach her to read. That's work. If you keep the land, I'll keep the house." Elias felt a surge of something he had not a name for. It was not a vow, not yet. It was the beginning of a plan that had in it the humbleness of what people do when they want to make a life. Trade labor, trade company, offer steady hands. "I'll need help with the roof," he said. "It took a storm last month. Won't be much fun, but it beats being empty." "Then we'll fix it," Clara said. "Together." The words were simple enough, and the promise between them was quiet. They did not speak of love as if it were a contract. They spoke of what needed doing and what they could offer. Mary Beth slept, a small contented knot at Elias's feet, and the night held them in a minimal trust that felt more honest than many larger proclamations. The morning they left the hollow, the ridge held a wind that threatened to take breath away. The crossing of the arroyo was a particular promise, a thin sheet of ice that had to be trusted to hold, and a deep watercolor beneath that threatened to take whatever fool stepped wrong. People tell stories of great heroics at such moments, but most of it was a matter of small, pragmatic steps. Elias led Ash carefully, ears tuned to the ice, feet near the horse's hooves to know their weight. Mary Beth clutched at Clara's skirt on the bank. They moved across in a single file. The ice whined underfoot. They felt, all at once, that the thing could break. For a moment the world seemed to stop. The river, the ridge, everything suspended like the breath before a man's voice. Then a small crack sounded, like a twig snapped by accident, and the ice did not open. Ash shifted her weight. Elias breathed out, slow and long. When they reached the far bank, Clara laughed, a short sound like someone who had been holding a worry and released it. Mary Beth danced once, a child testing the fact that she was safe. It was a small, perfect ceremony, the kind that stitches two lives together in the absence of grand gestures. They rode for the ranch with the smell of timber and old rain in their nostrils. Cotton Ridge receded like a place they once lived in, all at once familiar and removed by the memory of being watched. The long, low shape of Elias's house appeared behind a stand of pines, the roof jagged where the storm had taken it, the chimney leaning like a knuckle. He felt, at the sight, an odd mix of grief and determination. The house had been a temple of the ordinary for Ruth. Now it was a place that needed to be made into something again. They dismounted and walked the horses into the lean-to. Ash nosed the feed bag as if nothing heavy had happened. Elias put his hand on the door and felt the old grain of the wood twang like a remembered song. Inside, the house had been pillaged only by weather and time. A collapsed section of roof let a cold edge in. An old chair lay on its side. The hearth was gray with old ash. Elias moved through it like a man reacquainting himself with a friend who had lost some teeth. He found the tin box beneath the hearth shelf where Ruth had kept her recipes and small treasures. The lid came off with a stubborn creak, and the smell of flour and lavender lifted like the echo of a voice. There was a curl of paper that had been tucked inside, another scrap, or perhaps a page torn from Ruth's neat notebook. He sat and read it slowly, the handwriting familiar and human. It spoke of small things, a place by the river where she liked to watch birds, a recipe for rolls with the yeast to be fed at dawn, a line that Elias had missed before, tucked in like a seed. If you go back, go with bread. The sentence pulled him with a soft, strange force. Perhaps Ruth had meant, when she said go back, to tie the act to sustenance and courage. They set to work with the blunt, daily business of rebuilding. Clara had an easy competence. She warmed by the fire and scrubbed the hearth, while Elias sorted beams and made lists in his head of what to mend first. They hauled timber together, their hands working in the shared rhythm of people who had learned to do hard things in pairs. There were neighbors who came by, no fanfare, only a wagon with extra shingles, a boy with nails, a woman with jars of stew. Cotton Ridge, which had been quick to whisper, was slower to help in the face of a man doing the right thing. People prefer to imagine themselves better than their gossip. When they saw Elias working with Clara and Mary Beth by his side, the urge to repair a community found its muscle. They found more of Ruth's things tucked away in corners, a shawl heavy with the scent of mothballs and the memory of being wrapped around a child's shoulders. A recipe book with the margin notes she'd made, add a pinch more salt, sing while the dough rises. Each small object carried a weight that tugged a cord in Elias like a plucked string. He let it ache. He did not try to pretend the ache was gone. Instead, he sorted the objects into a small chest that Clara suggested should be kept by Mary Beth's bed. Memory needs a place, she said, so it doesn't sit on every shelf. Days passed with the elemental modesty of work. They put up rafters and braced the walls, they hoisted the new shingles and sealed the leaky places with a sealant of resin and simple curses. Mary Beth learned to fetch the hammer with Clara beside her, fingers small but steady. Elias found his grief taking a shape he could live with. Not absence removed, but presence shaded, meaning shaped around it by the slow unwrapping of daily tasks. There were nights when the town's shadow pressed close, when men with rumor in their mouths would pass and stand a distance to watch the three on the porch. There were also days when a neighbor brought sugar or a pot of preserved peaches. The world, Elias thought often, was not made of a single thing. It was knitted of the small overlapping acts of those who had nothing grand to offer but the small currency of bread and labor. One evening, after they'd banged a final board into place and the roof held without that melancholy list toward the sky, Elias and Clara sat by the newly kindled hearth. Mary Beth had drifted off in a chair, head lolling like a child too tired from a day of stacking memories. The hearth threw a soft light that made Clara's profile into something Elias wanted to keep committing to mind. The curve of her nose, the line of her jaw, the way her hands rested small and capable on her knees. "You don't have to say anything you don't mean," she said, in the sort of voice that does not need to be loud to be clear. Elias had a mind full of things he should have said in a language the world respects, vows, plans, promises he could not be sure of keeping. He had learned, in the long months since Ruth's fever, that words can betray a man as surely as silence can. He also knew that action spoke with a stubborn honesty that rarely misled. "I don't know the right words," he said. "I know how to wake up early and mend a roof. I know how to make sure there's bread. I know the names of the horses and the length of the furrows. I can promise to be there. I can't promise tomorrow will look like anything but work." Clara smiled, the sort of smile that feels like a hand on a frozen day. "That's enough," she said. "Promises that come wrapped in work last longer." He wanted, for a moment, to take her hand and say the things men occasionally put into letters, soft declarations that seemed to bind two lives to a neat knot. Instead, he reached for the small practical thing he knew he could follow through on. He stood and moved to the table where Ruth's notebook lay and retrieved the scrap that had started everything. He smoothed it out and placed it between them. "She wrote that, did she?" Clara asked. "Yes," Elias said. "I think." He stopped because there was still something he didn't know how to form into speech. The scrap had been a summons and a riddle. He had carried it with the weight of both. Now, with the house stitched up, and with a woman beside him who could knead dough and talk reason into the world, he felt the old phrase change shape. He read the few lines aloud, and they sounded like the sediment of a life. "Go back," he said. "To what she loved, maybe. To what made her brave. I don't think Ruth wanted us to curl into what was gone. I think she wanted—" He searched the fire-lit room for the word. "Continuity," Clara offered. "A way to carry forward what keeps a person sweet instead of sour." He nodded. "Bread, birds, little things that keep you honest. I couldn't go back to what it was because it isn't there. but I can go forward with what it taught me, and with Mary Beth, I can keep riding for her." Clara reached across the table and put her hand on his. The touch was practical, a pact. "Then let's keep riding," she said, "together." There was no grand ceremony, only the slow bending of two lives toward a common purpose. They made small plans: repair the fence in the spring, plant a little garden by the river, teach Mary Beth to sew, and to count the birds Ruth loved. The pledge between them was not a flashy vow. It was a ledger of tasks and promises, small but binding. Winter loosened, grudgingly, into a longer light. The porch filled more often with neighbors bearing gifts: sugar, a jar of preserved pears, a child's toy stitched by a kindly widow. Mary Beth began to plant sprouts of joy in the corners of the house, a small circle of dolls under a quilt, a line of stones leading to the river where she liked to sit and count the birds. Elias watched her with the keen attentiveness of a man who had learned to treat life like a garden: weed patiently, plant carefully, wait without the arrogance to expect outcomes beyond what steady care can bring. The scrap of paper, the letter that had begged, "Go back," sat in a shallow box with Ruth's things. Once, late in the spring, Elias opened the lid and read it again. Its meaning had settled into him like a seed finding soil. He saw now that Ruth had not demanded they return to a past she had known. She had offered an instruction in the language she had left behind, a small encouragement to return to the things that make a life human: bread, memory, the counting of birds. She could not have known that her words would send her daughter on a short journey and her husband on a longer one. The paper's plea had been answered not by returning to what was, but by carrying its small good forward. People in Cotton Ridge spoke less and helped more. The rumor of Hank Colton's men became, in time, a part of the storyteller's fabric, something parents used to remind children to be careful at night. The men who had once drawn close enough to circle a fence found, in a community that now had a repaired house and a steady stove, fewer easy boats to launch on. Perhaps the sight of three people who would not be easily frightened into leaving changed some minds. Perhaps it only meant the old quiet of people doing their work became more important than the drama of taking what others had. One evening, as twilight settled and the first stars pricked the wide sky, Elias stood at the threshold and watched Mary Beth and Clara in the yard. Mary Beth chased Copper, who pretended only half-heartedly to be outrun. Clara called out a small scolding about being careful with the river stones, and Mary Beth answered with the sort of high, unvarnished laugh only a child can manage. Elias held the scrap of paper in his hand. He felt the weight of it, the grief and the promise thin in the same palm. He could, in some literal sense, have turned the horse's nose back to Cotton Ridge and taken up the old life, carved out of the memory of his wife. But the scrap had done something else. It had sent his daughter into the world for a moment and invited him to follow. He had not gone back to a life lost. He had gone away for the person who would live into the future. He folded the paper and slid it into the box with Ruth's other small things. He closed the lid and felt, for the first time in a long while, the satisfaction of an act completed that did not erase the past but kept it honored. He thought of Ruth and of the woman's odd domestic command: "Go back," and understood at last the gentle instruction within it: "Return to what grounds you, so you can move forward with what matters." That night, they lit a lamp and sat together by the hearth. Mary Beth slept peacefully, hair against her pillow, the rag doll tucked into the crook of her arm. Clara hummed a tune as she mended a sleeve by lamplight, and Elias found his eyes following the motion of her hands. It was a scene stitched from small mercies: the pull of a needle, the curl of steam from a pot, the creak of an old chair. "I was thinking," Clara said softly, not looking up, "that Ruth must have liked this place. You two had a way with it." Elias nodded. "She loved the birds down by the river," he said. "She said once that if she could hear them every day she'd be content." "In time," Clara said, "we'll make enough noise of life that the birds won't be the only thing we count." He smiled at that, at the absurdity and hope of such a small promise. Outside, the night moved like a slow hand over the farm, and the stars watched with the ancient indifference of distant things. Elias felt, in the slow torrent of small tasks and steady hands, the making of a life that honored both what had been and what could be. He had carried Ruth's scrap like a compass for a while, and had learned that a compass can point not just backward, but forward too. When he finally put the house to bed and drew the quilt over his shoulders, the last thought that came to him was not of loss alone, but of the child at his ribs and the woman who had come to stand by the stove. The letter had begged him to go back. It had asked for a return to some tender place. In reply, he had kept writing for her. For Mary Beth, whose small hands braided the future into place, for a house mended with patient labor. For Clara, whose steady courage had become a kind of shelter. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like an old story told again. The river kept on, patient and unstoppable, and in the house a lamp burned steady. Tomorrow would bring new work, new small challenges. There would be days heavy with weather, days with less bread than they'd like, times when gossip would circle like crows. But the site of their lives had shifted. No longer a cottage of grief kept empty and sacred, but a home made by hands and filled with the noise and warmth of living. Elias slept, and in his dreams he carried the scrap of paper gently as if it were a map. In the morning he would saddle Ash again, and there might be a need to ride, to check fences or to meet a neighbor. He would find, in the economy of daily life, the shape of what it meant to honor a past without chaining the future to it. The letter had begged him to go back. He had read it, he had listened, and he had answered in the only way that made sense for the life he had left, by riding forward for a small girl who trusted him to bring her home.